When I briefed the Council last month, I drew attention to the deepening humanitarian crisis in South Sudan. Some 6 million people, more than half of the population, are currently in need of humanitarian assistance. Of these, a staggering 2.8 million people are severely food insecure. Over 2 million people have been forced to flee their homes, and more than half of all school-aged children are not attending class. And Mr. President, despite the Council's presidential statement on the 17th of March calling on all parties to protect civilians, allow people to move freely, and to facilitate timely, full, safe and unimpeded humanitarian access, yet again I have to report the situation remains dire. Civilians continue to be targeted, attacked and displaced, and acute humanitarian needs persist, exacerbated by recurrent access challenges. In addition to the unimaginable individual and community abuses that the people of South Sudan have sustained, I must also highlight that despite the call for a cessation of hostilities in the peace agreement, the geographic scope of the conflict has grown. In recent months, as we have just heard from SRSG Loy, we have seen new outbreaks of violence in areas around Western Bahr el-Ghazal, Western Equatoria, Jonglei and Malakal. Such violence has resulted in the displacement of well over 150,000 people, with many forced to flee their homes repeatedly, some more than 10 times. By way of example, on the same day I briefed the Council last month, fighting erupted in Pibor and surrounding areas, resulting in the displacement of around 13,000 people. Further, some 8,000 internally displaced people seeking refuge in Mboro, Western Bahr el-Ghazal, were forced to flee that area again when fighting erupted on 21st March. A woman who had sought refuge in Mboro and then had to flee to Wau said, and I quote, "We survived on leaves and turmeric. All our belongings, including food, were looted." Close quote. Let us not forget that nearly 200,000 people continue to seek protection inside United Nations protection of civilians sites, as they still do not feel that it is safe enough to return home. Regrettably, the sanctity of these sites has not been respected, and more than 25,000 people remain displaced as a result of the events in Malakal. Humanitarians and UNMISS continue to work together to make the conditions in these sites as decent as possible. However, the sites will never be a replacement for the places that people call home. Children remain particularly vulnerable to the expanding conflict. In recent months, children have been separated from their parents while trying to flee the fighting, including we have 84 documented cases following the events in Malakal. Moreover, schools and health facilities, inviolable under international humanitarian law, have been damaged or destroyed, denying children access to education and healthcare. Mr. President, these new conflict-afflicted areas are the same locations where people are most desperate for help. Displaced, food insecure and vulnerable, these are the populations we must be seeking to aid and protect. However, they cannot be reached by aid workers due to a host of impediments that continue to hamper aid operations. In 2015, more than 900 access incidents were reported by humanitarian partners in South Sudan, representing a 14% increase from the previous year and a 68% increase from the year before that. This year, the trend continues. In the 14 days since the presidential statement of 17th March, more than 17 incidents of obstruction of access for humanitarian activities have been reported, comprising interference by parties from individual armed actors through to national authorities. The true number is likely to be far higher, given some humanitarian partners are reluctant to report every incident out of fear of retribution or harassment. For example, last week in Unity, local authorities demanded free transport to Juba aboard the contracted plane of an international NGO. When the pilots refused, citing their duty to uphold humanitarian principles, a truck loaded with armed men arrived at the airstrip and threatened to detain the pilots if they did not oblige. Such action compromises the ability of humanitarians to safely and effectively deliver humanitarian assistance and is simply unacceptable. In Malakal, after the horrific violence in mid-February, humanitarians were denied river access to Wau Shiluk for over 1 month, disrupting the delivery of life-saving assistance to over 27,000 people. In a location where homes and businesses had been looted or destroyed, leaving only minimal resources, the denial of access presents a genuine threat to lives. Access was finally granted when remaining water and nutrition supplies were days away from exhaustion and schools had already closed as supplies had run out. The lifting of restrictions came only after interventions from the humanitarian community, the Special Representative of the Secretary General, the Chairperson of the Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, and visits by several ambassadors from various countries to Malakal to speak with the Governor. Mr. President, delays in delivery of assistance costs lives and expends precious resources. What humanitarians need is timely, unimpeded access to those we assess are in vital need, not ad hoc, case-by-case considerations after much attention, pressure, and persuasion. The challenge in South Sudan is an increasing disconnect between the assurances of national and the actions of local groups. All too often, even when official assurances are received at the national level, they are not respected by local actors. Illegal exactions and taxes remain rampant, and humanitarian convoys are consistently subjected to demands for payment at checkpoints. Despite the government's statement that humanitarians should not pay at such points, authorities at the local level have conveyed a very different message, noting that humanitarians should, I quote, expect to make such payments. Convoys traveling from Juba to Bentiu by road recently reported over 50 checkpoints, with each truck required to pay a total of more than 30,000 South Sudanese pounds, that's about $1,000 in exactions. Such extortions are unacceptable and must stop. The United Nations Department of Safety and Security has also been denied access to conduct security risk assessments in areas where fighting has taken place. Since January 2016, security risk assessment missions have been denied 6 times in central Equatoria alone. These risk assessments are a critical first step to assessing, preparing, and enabling effective humanitarian action. And in addition to the expanding geographic scope to the conflict, new drivers of crises are emerging and vulnerabilities are being exacerbated, resulting in additional humanitarian and protection needs. Most notably, the deteriorating economic situation is driving instability. As a result of the economic crisis, the monthly cost of food and clean water for an average family now amounts to more than 10 times the salary of a teacher. Such pressures are felt most acutely in urban and population centres. In the northwestern areas of northern Bahr el Ghazal and Warab, heightened food insecurity, compounded by economic downturn and growing unrest, has resulted in the flight of some 38,000 people into East and South Darfur since end of January. And Mr. President, on average, more than half of the access incidents reported involved violence against humanitarian personnel or their assets. When I briefed the Council last month, I reported that 47 humanitarian staff have been killed since December 2013. I am appalled to report that this number has now risen to 49. The most recent case is that of Mr. Yen Malhuth, an integrated community caseworker for Save the Children, a husband and a father of 2 children, who was tragically shot in Akobo, Yongli. Greater action must be taken to ensure the safety of humanitarian workers. Since the beginning of 2016, there have been at least 4 major instances of the destruction or looting of humanitarian supplies and facilities. These have taken place in Malakal, Pibor, and Western Equatoria. Vital goods such as nutritional supplements, education materials, and water treatment supplies have been burned or deliberately destroyed. A conservative estimate places the value of humanitarian losses since the beginning of 2016 at around $10 million, including more than $5 million in damages to the Malakal protection of civilians site. Much more important than the monetary losses is the loss of human life that results from these wanton attacks against humanitarian facilities and assets. Each time a facility or a compound is damaged or destroyed, and each time supplies are looted, vulnerable civilians are denied vital assistance. And Mr. President, despite the challenges, humanitarian partners continue to stand in solidarity with the people of South Sudan. In 2015, and despite the access challenges presented to them, partners were able to reach more than 4.5 million people with assistance, often in the most remote areas. In the first 2 months of 2016 alone, partners reached more than 1 million people. Humanitarians continue to find innovative ways to save lives, even in areas where formal access is not granted. For example, partners reached over 100,000 people with life-saving assistance in Unity last year amidst violent conflict and access denials. However, despite the courageous efforts of our colleagues on the front lines and the intensive work of humanitarian partners to scale up their capacity, a critical lack of funding continues to severely hobble the humanitarian efforts today. Of the required $1.3 billion earmarked to reach over 5 million people, only 9%, yes, only 9% of the funding has been received from the international community. Amidst a food and nutrition security crisis, NGO partners are scaling down nutrition and health programs because they simply have not received the funding needed to operate. And the small window of opportunity afforded by the dry season will close in the coming weeks, and the funding received has only allowed humanitarians to pre-position 35% of the required supplies across the country. As a result, more supplies will have to be moved by air during the rainy season, increasing the cost of delivery by up to 6 times. And Mr. President, the Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights will speak in greater detail to the human rights violations and grave protection concerns in South Sudan. But what is clear from the humanitarian perspective is that both parties have failed to abide by their obligation to protect civilians and civilian facilities, and simultaneously failed to allow full, safe, and unimpeded humanitarian access to those in critical need. Mr. President, the terms of the peace agreement have clearly not been enough to halt the rapidly escalating and worsening situation and its implications for millions of civilians across the country. We need action. To this end, I ask the Council to call on the parties to the conflict and all armed actors operating in South Sudan to uphold their obligations under international humanitarian and human rights law, to protect civilians, allow free and unhindered humanitarian access, and to protect humanitarian workers and their assets. Since my last report, since the peace agreement, let my message to this Council today be unequivocal. The hideous facts on the ground are that the humanitarian situation has severely worsened in that short time. It continues to worsen, and the only measure I am using are the lives, the suffering, and the deaths of millions of innocent women, girls, boys, and men caught up in the horrendous fight between two sides who have no care for the people they claim to represent. In light of this, I call upon the Security Council to stand in solidarity with the people of South Sudan and to advocate within your areas of influence to seek an end to the unfolding humanitarian catastrophe. Thank you.
I thank Mr. O'Brien for his briefing. And I now give the floor to Ms. Kate Gilmore.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much, Mr. President, distinguished members of the Council, Your Excellencies, esteemed colleagues. On behalf of the High Commissioner, I thank you for this opportunity to brief you on the findings of the assessment mission to improve human rights accountability, reconciliation and capacity in South Sudan. In short, the findings are that despite the August 2015 peace agreement, human rights violations and abuses against the civilian population continue unabated. Since December 2013, All parties to the conflict have committed gross human rights violations and abuses, along with serious violations of international humanitarian law, including killing of civilians, widespread sexual violence against women and girls, pillaging and destruction of civilian property, including homes, humanitarian infrastructure, schools, medical facilities, even hospitals. Both the government and the opposition have forcibly conscripted children, some as young as 9, in violation of international human rights law, international criminal law, and international humanitarian law. The SPLA and allied militia systematically perpetrated rapes and other acts of violence against women during its military offensive in Unity State. Rape in particular was used as a strategy to terrorise and punish civilians. From April to September last year, the United Nations recorded more than 1,300 reports of rape in Unity State alone. The High Commissioner, like the Africa Union Commission of Inquiry, finds there are reasonable grounds to believe that allegations of gross violations, including those committed in 2015, may constitute war crimes or crimes against humanity. The High Commissioner's report also finds a new and alarming spread of violence and insecurity to areas previously less affected by the conflict. In Western Equatoria, for example, the government's intensively militarised response to insecurity has been met with resistance from an increasing number of armed defence groups. But it is civilians who are caught in the middle. Furthermore, the space for the exercise of freedom of expression, including dissent, has narrowed considerably, with human rights defenders, journalists and other civil society actors subjected to intimidation, harassment, attack and detention without due process. This curtails democratic space, violates the state's international human rights obligations and no doubt further undermines prospects for sustainable peace. Mr. President, a legacy of violence and revenge underscores South Sudan's urgent need for accountability for both past and present-day human rights violations and abuses, as well as violations of international humanitarian law. Yet in spite of the repeated public and formal commitments given by the parties to the conflict to end the violence and punish perpetrators, no evidence has been found of any genuine effort by either the government or the opposition to live up to these undertakings. If South Sudan as a country and its people as rights holders are to realise sustainable peace, security and development, the long-standing vicious cycle of impunity must be broken. The perpetrators of human rights abuses and violations of international humanitarian law and of other international crimes must be held to account. South Sudan must address the underlying problems and root causes, including historical grievances that led not only to the current conflict, but which undermine prospects for its enduring resolution. The peace agreement, notably its provisions on accountability and transitional justice, provides useful elements in this regard. Chapter 5, for example, provides for the creation of a Commission for Truth, Reconciliation and Healing, a hybrid court for South Sudan, and a compensation and reparation authority. However, to date, as you have heard, the Transitional Government of National Unity has not been put into place, and these other mechanisms are therefore not established, even though the Africa Union has taken some steps towards discussing the establishment of the hybrid court. Transitional justice mechanisms should be established in line with international norms and standards. There must be genuine consultation based on informed participation of victims, civil society actors, including women's groups, and all other relevant stakeholders. There must be needs assessments to informed efforts aimed at truth, reparations, reconciliation, and guaranteeing non-recurrence. And for such consultations to be comprehensive, meaningful, and inclusive, they must be conducted over a significantly longer period than the minimum 1 month stipulated in the agreement. Above all, the necessary preconditions for the establishment of these transitional justice mechanisms, a complete cessation of hostilities, improved security, commensurate resources, and a high level of political commitment, these preconditions must all be met. Mr. President, at its recently concluded 31st session, the Human Rights Council adopted a resolution establishing a Commission on Human Rights in South Sudan. Its mandate is to monitor and report on the situation of human rights, provide guidance on transitional justice, accountability, reconciliation, and on healing. The Council also mandated the new Commission to make recommendations on technical assistance to the transitional government to support transitional justice, accountability, reconciliation, and healing. However, this mandate is predicated on the transitional government being fully operational, fully committed to ending violence against the civilian population, and fully cooperative with the hybrid court for South Sudan. The formation of the accountability and transitional justice mechanisms for South Sudan will not be without their challenges, but they are essential. The High Commissioner calls on the African Union to swiftly establish the hybrid court with a designated unit in support of witnesses and victims, including those subjected to sexual violence and those who are children. However, he notes with concern that this court will only try the most senior officials responsible for human rights violations and abuses. Many more perpetrators need to face the justice that is so critical for lasting peace. This responsibility will fall to South Sudan's courts, which currently do not have the capacity to conduct such trials. Failure to address the deeply ingrained disregard for human life will only lead to further violations. The lasting and only viable solution to the terror and pain perpetrated against the people of South Sudan is to dismantle the apparatus of violence, hold to account those who have imposed such egregious suffering, and put an end to the cycle of impunity. Hostilities must cease promptly and conclusively, and the international community must do what is needed to support the transitional government of national unity once formed, so that these transitional justice mechanisms can be instigated to function fully and effectively throughout their necessary lifespan. Enduring peace in South Sudan and justice for its people requires that these steps be taken immediately and with urgency. I thank you, Mr. President.
I thank Ms. Gilmore for a briefing, and I now give the floor to the representative of South Sudan.
Mr. President, I am pleased and honored to address the Security Council under your presidency. Permit me to begin by congratulating you and your delegation on assuming the responsibility for the month of March 2016 and for the manner you manage the presidency of the Security Council for this month. I would like to assure you, Mr. President, of the full support and cooperation of my delegation in your endeavors for the few hours left on your presidency. I would also like to utilize this opportunity to thank Mrs. Elaine McGrath Lodge, Special Representative and Head of the United Nations Mission in South Sudan, UNMISS, Stephen O'Brien, Under Secretary General for Humanitarian Affairs, Mrs. Kate Gilmore, Deputy High Commissioner for Human Rights, and Mr. Festus Moga, Chair of the Joint Monitoring and Evaluation Commission, JMAC, for the briefing, which provide more depth to the issues raised in this briefing. Mr. President, first and foremost, I would like to reiterate to the Security Council the commitment of my government in the implementation of the peace agreement. And thus far, we have implemented what has been required of the parties by the agreement. Mr. President, the government of South Sudan is grateful and appreciative to the effort of the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, IGAD, countries, international community, including members of TRECA and the EU, for enabling the parties to sign the agreement on the resolution of conflict in the Republic of South Sudan in August 2015. The implementation of the peace process is progressing well despite the delays in the formation of the Transitional Government of National Unity. Nevertheless, the coming to Juba of 22 SPLM AIO senior police officers, 39 and 40 commissioned and non-commissioned officers, plus the 15 bodyguards of Dr. Riek Machar. Today, we have received a total number of 130 troops in Juba. It is a positive sign in right directions. My government has committed itself to transport the SPLA-IO forces from Kaldak to Malakal, while some of the forces are in Bentiu and Pakak. The forces in Pakak will be airlift from Gambela in Ethiopia. We acknowledge and appreciate the assistance from the UNMISS, TRECA, and the EU airlifting them to Juba. Mr. President, as agreed by the parties and JEMEC, by the end of this week, if everything remains as planned, the UNMISS, TRECA, and the EU continues to airlift the SPLA-SPLM IO from the location above mentioned. The entire 1,370 agreed forces will be in Juba, paving the way for the Dr. Riek Machar to eventually come to Juba. Thereafter, the formation of the Transitional Government of National Unity will be completed. Mr. President, as far as the humanitarian situation in the country is concerned, as I stated before the Council in my last month's statement, the humanitarian situation in my country is not singularly caused by conflict as humanitarians would want the world to believe. Therefore, as we focus on conflict-related humanitarian situation, we should not forget the dire situation caused by climate change through long drought or heavy rains, which more often not than have devastating effect on the population. Mr. President, the 1996 World Food Summit described the state of food security as existent when all constituents within a nation state at all period of time have both physical as well economic access to nutrient food in a sufficient quantity. Dietary need must be met and preference should support a healthy and active lifestyle. According to FAO 2009, generally the 4 critical pillars of food security have been identified as the availability of food, access to population, utilization, and finally, stability. The principal consideration for South Sudan as a new country stems from the fact that the right to food is inherent within the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights and is vital important in order to enjoy other rights. Likewise, while the 1996 World Summit on Food Security established that food insecurity should not be employed as tools for political or economic pressure. However, the reality is vague. Mr. President, it is the government of South Sudanese hope that with the implementation of the peace agreement and the NGO Act, governance, the humanitarian situation will improve and allow the displaced person, both in IDPs camps and the POC, to return home. Mr. President, the government of South Sudan regrets the incident reports by the humanitarian agencies and the life loss of some humanitarian workers. It is not in the wish of the government of South Sudan to continue to fall into the abyss. It is certainly our interest to promote stability and national healing, and based on reports on the ground, the government of South Sudan commits to providing as much assistance as it can to the humanitarian community to help them facilitate their work as they aid our people with vital services. It is our hope that this regrettable incident decrease and that normalcy and unknown phenomenon in South Sudan begins to become a reality. Mr. President, I would like to conclude by saying that my government has officially responded to the recent Human Rights Council report on my country. And the Human Rights Council, in its last circle, decided to appoint 3-person panel to report annually to the Council, a decision that my delegation acknowledged. My country is also preparing its first universal peer review report to be delivered in October this year. Nevertheless, my government does not accept the allegation of organized and systematic killing, torture, and rape attributed to the government soldiers and its allied militia. I would like to quote here from the response of my government. It is acknowledged that the SPLA, the SPLA-IO, and other criminals use the same uniform unless the culprits are physically apprehended. It is impossible to determine whether it is the government soldiers and its allied militia, the SPLA-IO, or other armed criminals committed the crime, end quotes. This quote is consistent with a previous report of the Secretary General, which stated that the SPLA uniform is widely available. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank the representative of South Sudan for his statement. I now invite council members to informal consultations to continue our discussion on the subject. This meeting is adjourned.
compré un uniforme amarillo, pues. Amarillo pollito. Está aquí.